Life at sea in the 19th century was unlike anything on land. Ships were small, crowded, and exposed to the whims of wind, weather, and waves. Sailors were expected to know every rope, every sail, every knot, and yet the routines of daily life were far stranger than most could imagine from the safety of a harbor. Aboard merchant vessels, whaling ships, and naval vessels alike, the ordinary day was punctuated by extraordinary habits, rituals, and oddities that seem bizarre to modern eyes. For starters, consider the sleeping arrangements. Sailors did not have cozy cabins or private quarters. Hammocks were strung wherever space allowed, sometimes in the gun deck, sometimes in narrow passageways barely wide enough to swing without bumping elbows. These hammocks were tied high, swaying with the motion of the ship, and sailors often slept in shifts. The smell of salt, sweat, and tar clung to every fabric. And yet, men grew accustomed to this, forming an almost superstitious attachment to their sleeping spots. Some claimed that moving a hammock even a few inches could bring bad luck for the day, and so certain sailors spent years leaving theirs in precisely the same spot, tied to the same beams. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another defining aspect of life at sea. Long voyages meant infrequent washing, and fresh water was a precious commodity. Sailors bathed rarely, sometimes going weeks without a proper scrub. Instead, saltwater rinses were common, followed by a vigorous rubbing with sand or tar to remove grime. The result was a curious, persistent odor, one that sailors came to accept as part of their identity. This smell became intertwined with camaraderie. Newcomers were teased for smelling like landlubbers, while seasoned hands carried the scent of the sea as a badge of experience. Food habits were equally peculiar. Fresh provisions rarely lasted long. Ships carried salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and whatever vegetables could survive the voyage. A typical breakfast might be a thin slice of ship's biscuits soaked in brine or coffee, accompanied by a small ration of salted pork. Meat was often packed with lard or salt to prevent spoilage, yet still sometimes harbored maggots. Despite this, sailors developed elaborate ways to make the food tolerable or even tasty. Hardtack could be softened in tea, beer, or rum. Beans were soaked for days, and occasional foraging during port stops allowed a bit of freshness to enter the monotonous diet. Drink, too, followed strange patterns. Rum rations were standard in the Royal Navy, and while American sailors did not always have such a regimented schedule, alcohol was often a preferred hydration source. Beer, small quantities of wine, or distilled spirits were used to make water safer to drink, though excessive consumption could lead to arguments, accidents, or misadventures. Sailors quickly learned the delicate balance between staying lively enough to perform ship duties and staying sober enough to avoid disaster. Then there were the superstitions. Life at sea was inherently dangerous, and sailors relied on rituals to ward off disaster. Whistling below deck was forbidden, lest the wind die down or storms arise. Certain knots or tools had to be arranged in precise ways. Others had to be avoided entirely. Animals aboard ship, cats, dogs, even pigs, were thought to bring luck, misfortune, or guidance depending on their behavior. And of course, there were the omens sailors swore by: a black cat crossing the deck, a seagull flying too close, or even the appearance of a rainbow at sunset could dictate actions for the following day. Amid all of this, personal habits emerged as a combination of necessity, superstition, and boredom. Sailors developed strange routines, chewing on old rope for comfort, carving initials into beams, or wearing amulets around their necks. Letters from home were treasured, and keeping them safe sometimes led to peculiar hiding spots. Even sleep schedules could be dictated by luck rather than logic. Each habit, no matter how odd, had its purpose, sometimes practical, sometimes psychological. Finally, consider social hierarchies. Sailors were constantly aware of rank, status, and the unwritten rules of behavior. Certain oddities, like who got the prime hammock, who was allowed to handle the captain's provisions, or who could speak on deck first, carried weight. A misstep could mean ridicule, punishment, or exclusion from the small community that ship life demanded. In many ways, the weird habits of sailors were not simply quirks. They were survival strategies, a language of adaptation, and a framework for life in a perilous, unpredictable environment. By observing these behaviors, one begins to understand that 19th century sailors lived in a world defined by extremes: isolation and community, danger and routine, superstition and practical ingenuity. What might seem irrational from the safety of land was in fact an evolved culture, crafted over decades, that allowed men to survive, navigate, and even find comfort amid the endless horizon of the sea. Life aboard a 19th century ship was governed by routine, but these routines often looked strange to anyone who had never spent time at sea. Sailors operated on schedules dictated by tides, watched shifts, and the whims of wind and weather. Yet within these practical requirements, a host of peculiar rituals emerged. Habits born of necessity, superstition, and the endless hours of monotony. Morning began early. Sailors were roused by the call of the boatswain's whistle, often before the sun had risen. The first task was usually cleaning. Decks were scrubbed with sand and seawater, a practice known as holy stoning. Sailors knelt, rubbing their knees and hands raw as they polished the wood, creating a smooth, gleaming surface. It was laborious, repetitive, and strangely meditative. A well-polished deck was not only a matter of pride, but also a safety measure, preventing slips on the wet planks. Breakfast was no culinary delight. Hardtack soaked in cold water, coffee, or sometimes weak beer formed the base of the morning meal. Salted meat, if available, was sliced thin and shared among men who had learned to tolerate the peculiar taste and texture. Despite the meager fare, the ritual of eating together held social significance. Men shared stories, complaints, and news from port visits, forming bonds through collective endurance of the morning meal. Hygiene, as limited as it was, had its own rituals. Sailors carried a small bundle of cloth for washing, but water was scarce and precious. Some dipped rags into buckets of seawater to scrub their faces, hands, and necks. Teeth were cleaned with cloth and salt, or occasionally soot from the galley fire, a practice that sounds terrible today, but was considered effective then. Hair was combed with small, improvised combs, often made of wood or bone. Despite the lack of modern grooming, appearance mattered. Sailors took pride in maintaining a semblance of order, believing that a clean, presentable man could earn favor with officers or impress visitors when the ship reached port. Exercise and physical habits were equally peculiar. In the absence of gyms or organized sports, sailors improvised routines to maintain strength. Climbing the rigging, hauling sails, and balancing on narrow beams all served as daily exercise, but additional habits arose from boredom or superstition. Some sailors carried small weights to mimic lifting heavy cargo, while others practiced sword drills or rope knots repeatedly, honing skills for emergencies. Repetition, often obsessive, became a kind of rhythm that structured their day and warded off the restlessness of confinement. Then there were the superstitious rituals, which were deeply ingrained. Sailors avoided whistling below deck, believing it could summon storms. Rainbows, birds, and other natural signs were interpreted as omens. Some men carried charms, coins, or small talismans for protection. One sailor might touch a particular knot 3 times before setting sail, while another insisted on walking backward across a hatchway to avoid bad luck. These practices were performed with earnest seriousness, and ignoring them could provoke ridicule or tension among the crew. Meal preparation itself involved unusual routines. Sailors learned to ration food carefully, cutting hardtack into tiny pieces, soaking it, or crumbling it into soups. Porridge was stirred with a particular rhythm, and utensils were cleaned with precise care to prevent spoilage or contamination. The galley, small and often swaying violently with the waves, demanded both ingenuity and dexterity. Any lapse could result in burned food, spills, or accidents. These daily food rituals, while practical, also became a canvas for creativity. Men improvised ways to flavor meals, using scraps, herbs found in port, or leftover sauces, transforming monotony into small, private experiments. Sleep routines were equally ritualized. Sailors knew when their watch began and ended. Yet each man developed personal habits to cope with cramped hammocks and swaying decks. Some wrapped themselves in extra sails or blankets to block light and draft. Others chewed rope ends or wore makeshift eye masks to sleep better. Snoring was tolerated, but certain superstitions arose around it. A loud snorer might be nudged at a precise time to avoid disturbing the wind or incurring bad luck for the watch. Perhaps the strangest habits involved leisure. With limited entertainment, sailors developed eccentric hobbies. Knotting intricate patterns with rope, carving figures into wood, or writing letters they might never send became ways to pass the endless hours. Some practiced juggling or balance tricks on narrow rails, while others created elaborate games of chance using coins or scraps of paper. Every habit, no matter how minor, served a purpose: boredom relief, skill building, or maintaining social order. By the end of the day, sailors were bound to their routines, yet entirely creative within them. Each strange ritual, whether scrubbing the deck, chewing rope, or performing small superstitions, revealed the ways humans adapt to confined, dangerous, and monotonous conditions. The peculiar habits of 19th century sailors were not mere eccentricities. They were strategies for survival, social cohesion, and psychological comfort. Life at sea demanded more than work and superstition. It demanded constant attention to personal appearance, hygiene, and clothing. Yet in the cramped, damp, and salt-saturated environment of a 19th century ship, sailors developed habits that seem downright bizarre today. Solutions born of necessity, superstition, and improvisation. Here was a major concern. Long voyages meant months without proper washing, and fresh water was too precious for daily bathing. Sailors developed routines to cope. Some rubbed their hair with vinegar, salt water, or even gunpowder to remove grease and lice. Others meticulously combed and braided their locks, creating intricate patterns that doubled as protection against tangling in ropes and rigging. Hair might be tied back with strips of cloth or leather, forming functional styles that were also a mark of pride. Those who neglected grooming risked ridicule from shipmates, or even whispers of bad luck, since clean hair was believed to signal discipline and good fortune. Beards, too, had their rituals. While some officers required clean-shaven faces, ordinary sailors grew beards but maintained them obsessively. Brushing and trimming became daily tasks, often performed with improvised tools. The act of grooming was as much about hygiene as it was about morale. A well-kept beard indicated strength, attention, and respectability in the tight social hierarchy of a ship. Neglecting it was considered laziness, a moral as well as practical failing. Clothing it was another challenge. Sailors wore heavy, layered outfits designed to withstand wind, rain, and cold. Coarse wool trousers, linen shirts, and leather boots were standard, but each man had his own habits to preserve these garments. Clothing was often aired on deck, beaten with sticks, or brushed with sand to remove salt, dirt, and pests. Some sailors boiled shirts in seawater or vinegar solutions to disinfect them, while others relied on sun-drying or smoky galley fires. Each method was idiosyncratic, passed down from mentor to apprentice. Socks, gloves, and undergarments were treated with similar care. Sailors often rotated items, washing what they could, drying them carefully, and storing them in small bundles. Clothing served as both protection and morale. Damp or soiled garments could cause illness or discomfort, and sailors developed strange habits to prevent this. Rolling boots in dry sand, tucking woolen shirts into warm sails to dry, or even sprinkling powdery substances like chalk or ash to absorb moisture. Hygiene extended beyond clothing to the body itself. Bathing was rare and often opportunistic, performed during shore leave or when the ship anchored in calm waters. In between, sailors improvised. A damp rag, a splash of seawater, or a brisk rub with salt could substitute for a full bath. Some carried small pouches of scented herbs, powders, or oils to mask odors. Others relied on ritualistic routines, such as washing hands and face at precise times before meals or after handling cargo, believing these acts kept illness and misfortune at bay. Feet were treated with extraordinary care. Sailors spent hours on wet decks, and foot rot was a constant threat. Daily washing, airing, and rubbing with salts or oils became obsessive tasks. Some even carved small wooden blocks to massage their arches or maintain circulation. The smallest neglect could result in infection, blisters, or worse, making these seemingly odd habits a matter of survival. Even nails received attention. Though few would imagine sailors as meticulous about fingernails, they trimmed, filed, and cleaned theirs regularly. Sharp or dirty nails could catch on ropes, tools, or clothing, leading to injury. Like other grooming practices, nail care combined utility with ritual. A disciplined sailor displayed neat hands as a symbol of order and competence. Superstitions intertwine with hygiene and clothing. Some believe that washing on certain days, drying garments in specific ways, or combing hair in a particular pattern could prevent storms or misfortune. Ritualistic attention to clothing and appearance was thought to influence luck, health, and social standing on the ship. Even the smell of a sailor, clean, salted, or spiced, conveyed reputation and reliability among peers. Finally, personal grooming and clothing habits were often a form of psychological defense. Isolation, monotony, and harsh conditions at sea could erode morale. Meticulous routines provided structure, purpose, and small victories in an environment dominated by the unpredictable power of wind and waves. The obsession with hygiene, clothing, and personal rituals became a source of identity and pride, sustaining sailors both physically and mentally. By understanding these habits, we see how the 19th century sailor navigated not only the dangers of the sea, but also the peculiar challenges of daily life aboard ship. What might appear eccentric or obsessive today was, in fact, a combination of survival, superstition, and social order. These routines shaped the culture of sailors, creating a unique rhythm that governed work, leisure, and even personality on board. Life at sea revolved around the next meal, and 19th century sailors developed routines and habits around food that were often strange, extreme, or downright peculiar. Long voyages, limited supplies, and the constant threat of spoilage dictated every bite, every ration, and every method of consumption. Hardtack was the foundation of a sailor's diet. These rock-hard biscuits were baked to last for months, impervious to mold if kept dry, but utterly unpalatable when eaten plain. Sailors developed countless ways to soften and flavor hardtack. Some dunked it in coffee, tea, or soup to make it edible. Others boiled it in water to produce a mushy porridge. Creativity was essential. Even a simple meal required adaptation, improvisation, and sometimes a bit of desperation. Salted meat was another mainstay. Beef and pork were heavily cured with salt to survive the voyage, but this preservation method came with challenges. Some meats were so salty that sailors had to soak them in water for hours before cooking, sometimes changing the water repeatedly to make it tolerable. Others chewed small pieces slowly, savoring them with patience and caution. Spoiled or poorly cured meat could lead to illness, and superstition dictated that a bad batch was an omen of misfortune. Vegetables were scarce, and sailors often went weeks without fresh greens. When available, they were boiled or pickled, sometimes eaten raw, but always rationed carefully. Sauerkraut, turnips, and potatoes were common because they could survive long periods. Sailors developed routines to stretch these foods, slicing thin, combining with hardtack, or creating stews that could feed the crew over several meals. Every scrap was precious, and waste was seen as a moral failing as much as a practical one. Mealtimes themselves were ritualized. Ships operated on strict schedules, often dictated by the ship's bell. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were moments of structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. Sailors learned to anticipate each meal, often preparing their own utensils or small flavorings in advance. Those who missed a meal or ignored the ritual risked the ire of officers or the judgment of peers. Eating was not just sustenance. It was social, moral, and practical. Drink was also a matter of habit and superstition. Water and beer were rationed. Water could turn brackish or sour. Beer could become flat or moldy. Sailors learned to filter water, boil it when possible, and rotate supplies carefully. Some added small amounts of spirits, like rum, to water or tea, both for flavor and to stave off illness. These practices, strange to modern observers, were part of a broader culture of survival. Food storage was another source of odd habits. Hardtack was often wrapped in cloths, tucked into barrels, or stored in tightly bound sacks to keep it dry. Sailors sometimes hung bread from the ceiling or tied it to beams, a practice that seems bizarre but made sense in cramped quarters prone to moisture, pests, or flooding. Meat was smoked, salted, or buried under brine, while vegetables might be stored in barrels or boxes lined with sand. Every container, bundle, and bundle placement became part of a meticulous survival system. Sharing was a central part of shipboard culture. Meals were communal, eaten together on long benches or at makeshift tables. Rations were divided carefully, with officers sometimes receiving slightly better portions. The strongest or most senior sailors often controlled distribution, and disputes over food could quickly escalate. Sailors developed subtle rituals to ensure fairness, marking portions, rationing slices, and keeping close watch over each other's consumption. Some sailors even developed peculiar personal habits around food. One might nibble hardtack only after reciting a short rhyme or prayer, believing it would ward off scurvy or misfortune. Others chewed each bite a precise number of times, thinking it improved digestion or luck. These routines, strange as they appear, provided psychological comfort and a sense of control in an environment where danger was constant and unpredictable. Desserts or treats were rare, but when they appeared, candied fruits, small cakes, or dried raisins, they were handled with ritual care. Sharing a rare sweet was an occasion, often accompanied by storytelling, jokes, or boasts. Even a small pleasure became a structured event, reinforcing social bonds and morale. Through these eating habits, we see the complex intersection of necessity, superstition, and ingenuity. Sailors' routines around hardtack, salted meat, and sparse vegetables were survival strategies, social rituals, and sources of identity all at once. The unusual or obsessive habits were not mere eccentricities. They were adaptations to a harsh, isolated, and unforgiving environment. Life on a 19th century ship was unpredictable. Storms, disease, and accidents were constant threats, and sailors, practical, disciplined men though they were, developed a host of superstitions and rituals to manage fear and maintain a sense of control. Many of these beliefs intersected with food, hygiene, and daily routines, creating habits that seem bizarre to modern eyes but were integral to life at sea. One of the most widespread superstitions involved the hardtack and salted meat themselves. Some sailors believed that cutting bread in a crooked line or breaking a biscuit unevenly would bring bad luck. Hardtack was often tapped lightly on the deck or blessed with a casual knock before being eaten, a ritual meant to ward off scurvy or seasickness. Salted meat, if placed carelessly or left unwrapped, could invite misfortune. A sailor might sprinkle a pinch of extra salt on a slice to appease unseen spirits. Certain days were considered unlucky for specific actions. Fridays, in particular, were notorious. Sailors avoided baking, cutting bread, or handling meat on this day, fearing it would provoke storms or accidents. Breaking these taboos could lead to ridicule, a fine, or whispers of impending disaster. In contrast, other days were believed lucky, and routine tasks, cooking, rationing, even stirring porridge, were performed with extra care and ceremony. Animals on board were not exempt from superstition. Cats were thought to protect the ship from lightning and rats, but their presence also required rituals. If a cat walked across a loaf of hardtack, it was considered an omen. The biscuit might be discarded or used only in cooking rather than eaten plain. Similarly, birds, rats, or even seagulls interacting with food could be interpreted as signs from the sea itself, influencing how sailors manage their provisions. Sailors also developed charms and symbolic gestures tied to meals. Some carried small wooden or metal trinkets, hung from their belts or placed under plates, meant to ensure that bread and meat stayed fresh. Others traced patterns in flour or water before baking hardtack, believing these markings could shield the food from spoilage and misfortune. Rituals were highly individualized. One man's precaution might seem utterly strange to his bunkmate, but all served the same purpose: control over a world that was often chaotic and dangerous. Even hygiene and preparation were ritualized. Washing hands before handling bread, wiping down a table before slicing meat, or inspecting hardtack for cracks was not merely practical. It was infused with superstition. A loaf handled carelessly could bring illness or bad luck, while proper care, combined with a small gesture or prayer, could protect the sailor and the crew. This blend of observation and belief blurred the line between pragmatism and ritual. Sailors also had elaborate practices surrounding the first and last portions of a meal. The first bite of hardtack or a piece of salted pork might be chewed silently while thinking of home or a loved one, a symbolic act of respect for the food and the sea. The final portion, carefully divided, was often saved for a crewmate in need or left on the plate briefly as a gesture to spirits or the ocean. These habits reinforced community, maintained morale, and provided small anchors of stability amid uncertainty. Some superstitions bordered on the bizarre. It was said that whistling while slicing bread could summon storms, and a sailor caught humming a tune while breaking hardtack might be mocked or corrected. Even washing a cloth used to cover bread in salt water was practiced by some, believing it cleansed both the loaf and the spirit. These odd customs, repeated daily, became second nature, guiding behavior as much as any written rule or officer's order. Food shortages and spoilage further reinforced superstition. If a loaf of hardtack developed mold despite careful handling, sailors often assumed a curse or overlooked taboo rather than blaming moisture or poor storage. Conversely, a loaf that remained intact through a storm or long voyage might be treated with reverence, its preservation seen as a sign of divine favor. Such beliefs strengthened camaraderie, as shared rituals and tales became part of the crew's identity. The combination of superstition, ritual, and daily necessity created a distinct culture aboard 19th century ships. Every meal was a performance, a blend of survival, belief, and habit. Hardtack, salted meat, and sparse vegetables were not just sustenance. They were symbols of skill, caution, and faith. A sailor's ability to manage these rituals could influence his reputation, morale, and even the crew's overall fortune. Through these practices, we see that life at sea demanded more than physical endurance. It required psychological resilience. Superstition provided structure, reduced anxiety, and allowed sailors to impose order on chaos. Meals were both practical and symbolic, blending observation, creativity, and ritual in ways that seem unusual today, but were vital then. Life at sea in the 19th century was harsh, cramped, and often unsanitary. Sailors spent weeks or months on wooden ships, surrounded by salt water, sweat, and the constant odor of hardtack and tar. Personal hygiene, limited by both environment and knowledge, gave rise to some truly peculiar habits. Habits that were at once practical, ritualistic, and downright bizarre. Bathing was a rare luxury. Most sailors relied on a combination of seawater and sponge scrubbing, but even this was infrequent. In rough weather, taking a dip in the ocean could be dangerous, and on calm days, the icy cold of the water discouraged frequent use. As a result, sailors developed inventive routines to keep clean. Saltwater soaks were sometimes combined with sand or ash to scrub off grime, a practice that exfoliated skin but left a lingering salty scent. Hair care was another challenge. Without proper shampoo or combs in every cabin, sailors improvised. Some applied vinegar or beer to the scalp, believing it prevented lice and dandruff. Others rubbed a mixture of salt and oil into their hair, both to condition it and to keep pesky insects at bay. Long hair, when allowed, was often braided or tied with cloth to prevent tangling. While these methods might sound strange today, they were pragmatic solutions to persistent problems in a confined, damp environment. Beards were similarly managed with attention and superstition. Some sailors believed that trimming the beard on certain days brought bad luck. Others kept it long as a sign of experience or maritime skill. In addition to superstition, beards had practical purposes. They helped shield the face from salt spray and biting winds and could provide insulation during cold nights on deck. Yet maintaining a beard required ingenuity, saltwater rinses, occasional soap made from tallow, and careful combing with improvised tools were daily necessities. Nails, too, received peculiar attention. Dirt and grime accumulated quickly in shipboard conditions, and sailors learned to clean them with small knives, files, or even sand. In some cases, nails were deliberately left a little long to perform small tasks or scratch hard-to-reach spots, a practical adaptation that doubled as a ritual of tidiness. Clothing rituals were equally curious. Sailors had limited changes of garments, so laundry was infrequent. To manage odor and pests, they often aired out shirts and trousers on deck, sometimes sprinkling them with salt or vinegar. Certain garments were reserved for special occasions, like arriving in port, while everyday clothing was layered, patched, and repurposed repeatedly. Socks, hats, and scarves were sometimes boiled in seawater to sanitize them, a practice that smelled foul but kept infestations at bay. Foot care was another area of creativity. Long hours on wet decks and in tight boots led to sores, blisters, and fungal infections. Sailors rubbed their feet with lard, tar, or powdered chalk to reduce friction and dryness. Some even stuffed boots with dried herbs or leaves to absorb moisture and improve smell. Strange as it seems, these improvised treatments were effective enough to prevent debilitating infections in an era before modern medicine. Sleep and bedding created additional hygiene challenges. Hammocks and shared bunks were rarely cleaned, and lice or bedbugs were a constant nuisance. Sailors developed routines for shaking out bedding, airing it on deck, and sometimes applying vinegar or tobacco smoke to deter pests. Such habits were half practical, half superstitious. A hammock that smelled of vinegar was believed to bring safety and keep disease away. Even eating utensils and dishes followed odd rituals. Hardtack boards, wooden spoons, and tin plates were scrubbed with sand or ash and occasionally treated with salt water. Some sailors insisted on lining plates with leaves or cloth, partly for cleanliness, partly out of superstition, believing that food touching a bare plate could carry bad luck. These grooming and hygiene practices illustrate a combination of necessity, ingenuity, and superstition. Life at sea demanded adaptation. Sailors had to manage odor, disease, and appearance in ways that worked with the limited tools at hand. What seems strange today made perfect sense in the context of cramped decks, rolling waves, and months without fresh water or laundry. By observing these habits, we see how sailors turned daily survival into a series of small rituals. Practical, sometimes bizarre, always crucial. Each sponge bath, vinegar rinse, or salted boots served a dual purpose: maintaining health and asserting control over a harsh, unpredictable environment. The diet of a 19th century sailor was as peculiar as it was monotonous. Months at sea limited the availability of fresh foods, forcing crews to rely on long-lasting rations and whatever could be preserved, salted, or dried. This necessity created not only strange culinary habits, but also cravings and superstitions that shaped meals in ways outsiders would find bizarre. Hardtack, the ubiquitous ship's biscuit, was a cornerstone of the sailor's diet. Tough, dry, and often infested with tiny insects, it required soaking in water, coffee, or soup to be edible. Sailors developed countless techniques for softening it. Some wrapped it in wet cloths, others boiled it slowly, and a few even set it aflame briefly to toast away mold. Despite its blandness, hardtack became a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and shared hardship among crews. Salted meats were another mainstay, with pork and beef preserved in brine for months. The high salt content made them tough and sometimes unpleasant to eat, but they were reliable and calorie-dense. Sailors often paired these meats with vinegar, molasses, or hardtack to add flavor, or at least mask the monotony. Interestingly, some sailors developed peculiar taste preferences. Biting into an especially salty piece of pork might be considered a treat, while others deliberately sought the softest, least cured portions, even if they were riskier to eat. Preserved vegetables were rare, and fresh produce was even rarer. When available, they were consumed quickly to prevent spoilage, often cooked into stews or soups. Sauerkraut and pickled foods were prized for both flavor and their ability to prevent scurvy, a constant threat on long voyages. Sailors came to associate these strong tastes with health and vitality, creating habits that combined superstition with practicality. A meal lacking sauerkraut was considered unlucky or unhealthy. Molasses, sugar, and spirits played an outsized role in flavoring and morale. A small dollop of molasses on hardtack or in coffee was considered a delicacy, a momentary escape from blandness. Rum, used not only for drinking, but sometimes for cooking or softening rations, became embedded in daily rituals. Sailors believed it could ward off disease, warm the body on cold nights, and improve appetite. Practical, comforting, and culturally ingrained. Cravings developed in response to both necessity and monotony. Sailors sometimes sought out bizarre combinations. Hardtack soaked in molasses, salted pork dipped in vinegar, or even raw onions eaten with bread. These choices may seem strange, but they were logical adaptations to limited ingredients, taste fatigue, and the constant need for calories. Ship's journals record that sailors who strayed from these dietary norms often felt weaker or less energetic, reinforcing a collective taste culture that outsiders would find eccentric. Sea biscuits, dried beans, and peas supplemented meals, often boiled in thick soups with whatever meat or vegetables were available. This practice was practical. A single pot could feed dozens and prevent waste. Yet it also produced unusual textures and flavors that required an acquired taste. Crews became accustomed to gritty, lumpy stews, and those who failed to adapt sometimes fell ill or suffered from digestive discomfort. Water was a constant concern. Fresh water was rationed, and barrels often became stagnant or brackish. Sailors learned to mix it with grog, vinegar, or spirits to improve taste and reduce bacterial growth. This practice gave rise to a culture of improvised beverages, some of which would shock modern palates. Watered-down rum, spiced vinegar drinks, and even fermented ship's beer made for whatever grains were on hand. Meal schedules reinforced both routine and superstition. Breakfast, often hardtack with tea or coffee, was followed by a midday dinner of stew or salted meat, and a light supper. Missing a meal or consuming the wrong ration at the wrong time could spark rumors of bad luck or illness. Sailors often adhered strictly to these schedules, not just for nourishment, but as a form of psychological structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. Finally, communal eating shaped social hierarchy and behavior. Officers sometimes received fresher provisions or delicacies like biscuits with molasses, while ordinary sailors were assigned older, tougher rations. Sharing and trading food became a subtle negotiation of status and camaraderie. Hardtack could be split, salted pork swapped, or a rare fruit offered as a gesture of friendship. The unusual dietary practices of sailors were as much about social bonds as survival. These culinary quirks reveal how life at sea imposed both limits and creativity. The need for preservation, combined with long voyages and limited supplies, led to strange but logical solutions. Sailors adapted, experimented, and developed tastes that outsiders might find odd, yet each habit had a purpose: survival, morale, and community. Life aboard a 19th century ship was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and monotony. Beyond the physical hardships, storms, cramped quarters, and the ever-present threat of illness, sailors were bound by a complex web of beliefs and rituals designed to keep both the crew and their provisions safe. Food, especially bread and hardtack, became deeply intertwined with superstition, shaping behavior in ways that outsiders might find puzzling. One pervasive belief involved the timing and handling of bread. Sailors often insisted that a loaf be baked or broken at a specific hour to ensure good fortune. Some thought breaking bread before sunrise invited bad luck, while others believed that the first bite of a new loaf must be shared with a friend to prevent illness. These rituals, though seemingly irrational, were deeply ingrained and repeated with careful consistency. A loaf mishandled could be seen as a sign of misfortune, prompting sailors to adopt extra caution with both food and daily routines. Omens extended beyond timing. Sailors believed that certain behaviors while eating could predict the day's events. Crumbs scattered on the floor were thought to summon storms, while leaving the last bite of bread uneaten might bring injury or bad luck. Even the texture of a loaf could be read as an omen. A perfectly firm hardtack suggested safety, while one that crumbled too easily was a warning of potential trouble ahead. Superstition blended observation with imagination, guiding behavior and fostering a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Food storage itself became ritualized. Hardtack and salted meat were carefully arranged in barrels, baskets, or on shelves in patterns intended to maximize longevity and ward off mold. Some sailors placed charms, coins, or sprigs of herbs in food containers, believing these would protect both provisions and crew. Others recited short blessings or invocations before handling rations, combining practicality with magical thinking. Even if these actions had no scientific basis, they created structure, morale, and a sense of shared purpose among the crew. Rituals were also tied to hierarchy. Officers often oversaw the preparation and distribution of bread, while junior sailors learned proper methods through repetition and example. Mistakes in handling rations, dropping hardtack, spilling water on it, or storing it improperly could result in teasing, punishment, or in extreme cases, superstition-driven blame for accidents at sea. In this way, food management was both practical training and a reinforcement of social order aboard ship. Superstitions extended to specific types of bread or meals. Sailors believed that cornbread brought good luck on long voyages, while a loaf baked with uneven heat might signal imminent storms. Salted pork carried a dual reputation, essential for survival but dangerous if improperly stored, as spoiled meat was thought to invite sickness. Even the act of sharing a morsel of bread could carry symbolic weight, representing friendship, loyalty, or the warding off of ill fate. Daily life at sea was regimented, but superstition allowed for flexibility and creativity within structure. Sailors improvised when ingredients were limited, often inventing new rituals to explain success or failure. For instance, a crew might notice that bread left uncovered during a calm morning never molded, while a covered loaf spoiled in humid air. Superstitious explanations: the spirits favor open air, or the loaf absorbs the ship's mood, emerged alongside practical lessons, blending logic with legend. Even mundane tasks, kneading dough, slicing hardtack, soaking biscuits, were infused with significance. Sailors approached these chores carefully, knowing that small missteps could have consequences, real or imagined. This constant mindfulness created a culture of attentiveness, where even a simple loaf of bread was more than sustenance. It was a barometer of luck, discipline, and foresight. Interestingly, superstition also served a psychological purpose. Long voyages bred anxiety, isolation, and boredom. Rituals surrounding bread and meals offered predictability and control, reducing fear and providing comfort. Sharing these customs strengthened camaraderie, ensuring that even the most mundane aspects of life at sea became a source of cohesion and morale. In the end, the peculiar habits and beliefs surrounding bread reveal how sailors adapted to extreme conditions. Necessity, scarcity, and the dangers of the open ocean created a unique culture in which practical care, superstition, and creativity intersected. Bread was never just food. It was a symbol, a tool, and a daily lesson in vigilance, community, and survival. On a 19th century ship, hygiene was a constant challenge. Fresh water was limited, sailors bathed infrequently, and cramped conditions made disease an ever-present threat. Bread, a staple of daily rations, played a surprising role in this struggle, both as a practical food source and as a tool in the fight against illness. Illness aboard ship was feared more than storms. Dysentery, scurvy, and fevers could decimate a crew in days, and spoiled food often bore the blame. Soft bread, if not properly baked or stored, could quickly grow mold or attract vermin. Hardtack, while bland and unforgiving, was valued precisely because its longevity reduced the risk of contamination. Sailors learned quickly that a moldy loaf could be more than unpleasant. It could signal danger to health. Daily routines emphasized cleanliness around bread. Slices were handled carefully to avoid crumbs that might attract pests. Bread bins, barrels, and boxes were wiped regularly, sometimes with salt water or vinegar solutions. These measures were not merely about taste or appearance. They were preventive, aimed at reducing the spread of bacteria or fungi. In a world without germ theory, observation and experience guided practices that were surprisingly effective. Sailors also recognized that certain illnesses were linked to spoiled or damp bread. Moldy hardtack was often discarded, and bread that had become wet during storms was quickly dried or toasted. Some crews even held informal inspections, where officers checked rations for freshness. Sailors who ignored these warnings risked more than discomfort. They risked being incapacitated, unable to perform essential duties, and potentially jeopardizing the entire voyage. The intersection of bread and hygiene extended beyond storage. Meal preparation was an occasion for hand washing and utensil care, however rudimentary. Knives, cutting boards, and even simple wooden tables were scrubbed with seawater, vinegar, or sand. Slices of bread were often cut in a single motion and distributed immediately, minimizing exposure to air and pests. This attention to detail reflects a sophisticated, if informal, understanding of food safety, honed over years of trial and error. Bread also influenced medical beliefs. Sailors were keenly aware of the health benefits of certain ingredients. Whole grain bread was thought to strengthen the body, while salty hardtack helped prevent dehydration. Conversely, damp or sour bread was considered a cause of weakness, stomach complaints, or even more mysterious ailments. Folk remedies often accompanied rations. For example, a slice of dry hardtack might be soaked in tea or alcohol to purify it before eating. These practices combined practical food safety with superstition and emerging medical ideas. Illness prevention was inseparable from morale. A crew that feared spoiled bread was a distracted crew, more prone to accidents and errors. Officers encouraged routines that reinforced vigilance. Daily checks of rations, proper storage, and careful handling of soft loaves. When disease struck, the quality and handling of bread were scrutinized, often with dramatic interpretations. A moldy loaf might be cited as evidence of negligence or divine disfavor, reinforcing the importance of careful management. Even during long voyages, sailors improvised to maintain hygiene. Damp climates required drying bread before storage. Warm, humid conditions demanded extra ventilation in lockers. Sailors learned to rotate supplies, use cloth linings, and sprinkle salt or flour to mitigate spoilage. These practices reveal a constant negotiation between environment, human effort, and natural limits. A negotiation in which bread was both a participant and a barometer. Finally, hygiene and illness intersected with hierarchy and discipline. Officers monitored the care of bread as part of broader inspections of cleanliness, enforcing standards with penalties for lapses. Senior sailors taught juniors proper handling, imparting knowledge that was vital for survival. In this way, bread served not only as food but as a teaching tool, embedding lessons about responsibility, observation, and the collective effort required to maintain health aboard ship. In sum, Bread on a 19th century ship was far more than a ration. It was a marker of hygiene, a vehicle for health practices, and a daily reminder of the precarious balance between nourishment and disease. The vigilance required to keep bread safe mirrors the constant attention sailors paid to every aspect of life at sea, from deck maintenance to personal cleanliness. Life aboard a 19th century ship was defined by routine, hierarchy, and discipline. Every action, whether scrubbing the deck, manning sails, or handling rations, was governed by strict schedules and expectations. Bread, though simple in form, played a subtle role in maintaining this order. Its preparation, distribution, and consumption became intertwined with authority, obedience, and the rhythm of daily life at sea. The daily grind began with the rising sun, or often before it. Sailors woke early to the shrill call of the boatswain's whistle, moving quickly to their stations. Bread was usually the first ration of the day, either fresh from the ship's galley or carefully rationed from stores. Officers oversaw distribution, ensuring that each sailor received his allotted portion. This seemingly mundane task carried weight. Improper handling could spark complaints, disputes, or even accusations of favoritism. Bread, in other words, was a measure of fairness as much as nutrition. Discipline extended to consumption. Sailors were expected to eat quickly, efficiently, and without waste. Leftover crumbs were not tolerated. They could attract pests or signal carelessness. Hardtack, in particular, demanded ingenuity. Sailors softened it in water, coffee, or soup, often working in teams to break and share the brittle biscuits. Those who mishandled bread risked admonishment from officers or senior crew, reinforcing both skill and respect for resources. Punishments on ships could be severe, and food played a role in this system. Sailors caught violating rules, whether shirking duties, being insolent, or hoarding supplies, might face reductions in rations. In extreme cases, a misbehaving crew member could be confined to a dark space, forced to eat only hardtack, or even go without for a meal. Such measures were designed not to inflict cruelty, but to maintain order, ensuring that every hand was ready and attentive for the challenges of life at sea. Even the storage of bread reflected discipline. Officers expected lockers, bins, and barrels to be organized meticulously. Hardtack was stacked to allow airflow. Soft loaves were covered carefully, and rations were rotated systematically. A sailor who failed in this responsibility risked spoilage, waste, and the wrath of both peers and superiors. In this way, bread became a barometer of competence and conscientiousness. The routines surrounding bread also shaped camaraderie. Sharing hardtack, teaching a new recruit how to soften biscuits, or passing around small pieces of fresh loaf fostered informal bonds. Sailors learned to read each other's needs and skills, creating a cooperative culture within the strict hierarchical system. Even as discipline imposed order, these small acts of resourcefulness and mutual support helped crews endure the long, grueling days at sea. Work itself was exhausting, and bread provided both sustenance and comfort. While the galley could be hot, smoky, and cramped, the moment of breaking a loaf, especially a fresh slice, offered a fleeting sense of normalcy. Sailors often paired bread with salted meat, cheese, or even preserved fruit when available. These meals were quick but essential, reinforcing the rhythm of labor and the expectation that each man remained fit for duty. Punishments related to bread were also symbolic. A sailor who wasted rations could be publicly chastised, a subtle lesson in humility and responsibility. The care given to bread mirrored the care expected in other aspects of shipboard life: attention to ropes, sails, and cleanliness. In every corner of the vessel, meticulousness mattered, and bread, because it was essential yet perishable, stood as a constant test of reliability. Discipline extended to hygiene as well. Officers insisted that hands be cleaned before handling food, that crumbs be swept away, and that storage areas remain dry and ventilated. These practices, though not fully understood scientifically, reduced spoilage and prevented illness. Bread became a conduit through which sailors learned lessons about vigilance, foresight, and the practical importance of following rules. Finally, the daily grind reinforced timing, patience, and endurance. Meals were scheduled, duties were timed, and bread was rationed in harmony with the ship's broader operations. Missing a ration, spoiling supplies, or mishandling bread could disrupt the rhythm, affecting not just an individual but the entire crew. In this way, even the simplest loaf of bread was woven into the social, operational, and disciplinary fabric of life at sea. Bread, therefore, was more than food. It was a tool, a test, and a symbol. It reinforced hierarchy, trained attention, and structured the day. From handling hardtack to consuming fresh loaves, every interaction with bread carried lessons in obedience, efficiency, and cooperation. Sailors who mastered these routines survived better, worked more effectively, and contributed to the fragile equilibrium that kept the ship afloat. Life at sea in the 19th century was unpredictable, perilous, and often frightening. Sailors faced storms, disease, and the constant threat of accidents. And in this world of uncertainty, superstition filled the gaps that experience and science could not. Bread, simple, essential, and ever-present, became entwined with these beliefs. It was not merely sustenance. It carried symbolic power, ritual meaning, and even a touch of magic in the eyes of those who spent months on open water. One widespread superstition revolved around the first loaf baked or served on a voyage. Sailors often considered it unlucky to discard any part of this initial bread. Crumbs were carefully collected, sometimes sprinkled over the deck or thrown to the wind, believed to appease spirits of the sea. Breaking a loaf in half before the ship set sail was thought to ensure balance on the journey, a way to prevent misfortune from overtaking the vessel. In this way, bread became a conduit for hope, its handling ritualized to maintain favor with forces beyond human control. Certain days were seen as particularly auspicious or dangerous for bread. Fridays, for instance, carried a reputation for bad luck. Sailors might avoid baking or distributing bread on that day, fearing spoilage or misadventure. Similarly, the alignment of the moon influenced superstitious practices. Some crews believed that bread baked during the waning moon would mold faster, while dough worked under a full moon was said to rise better and bring good fortune. These beliefs, while unscientific, shaped the rhythm of baking, rationing, and consumption. Bread was also central to customs intended to protect the ship and crew. In some ports, sailors would place a loaf on the bow or stern before leaving harbor, a ritual offering meant to ensure a safe voyage. Others carried small pieces in their pockets or hammocks as talismans, a tangible reminder of home, security, and sustenance. In extreme cases, a loaf might be tossed overboard in a storm, an offering to the sea itself, blending practicality with superstition. Even the handling of spoiled bread was influenced by belief. Moldy or misshapen loaves were not always simply discarded. In certain ships, tossing a moldy slice overboard was thought to transfer bad luck away from the crew. Some sailors whispered prayers or cursed the offending bread before discarding it, blending ritual with humor, frustration, and the need for control over their environment. These acts reinforced a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable setting. Superstitions around bread extended to interactions among crew members. Sharing a loaf could symbolize trust or reconciliation after disputes, while hoarding bread was seen as inviting misfortune. A sailor who took more than his share might be accused of tempting the fates, and stories circulated of bad luck following selfish acts. Bread thus mediated social relationships, shaping fairness, morale, and cooperation through both superstition and practicality. The types of bread consumed also carried symbolic weight. Hardtack, long-lasting and unyielding, was a metaphor for endurance, patience, and resilience. Softer loaves, when available, were treated with extra care, almost reverence, as they represented comfort and a fleeting connection to home. Sailors often remarked on the luck of a fresh loaf, or cursed the misfortune of a stale one, blending daily experience with folklore and oral tradition. Rituals sometimes merged superstition with creativity. Sailors who feared spoilage might inscribe initials or small symbols on loaves before baking, believing it protected the food from both mold and ill luck. Others would place a pinch of salt or a piece of metal nearby. Gestures borrowed from folk remedies, but infused with symbolic meaning. The line between practical knowledge and superstition was blurred, and bread became a touchstone for both. Children or apprentices aboard ships, when present, learned these practices alongside daily routines. Observing ceremonies, hearing whispered warnings, and participating in small rituals taught them about hierarchy, safety, and the culture of the ship. Bread served as a living lesson in the interplay between superstition, survival, and social norms, embedding cultural memory in a tangible, edible form. Ultimately, these customs highlight how sailors navigated uncertainty. Bread, though ordinary, became extraordinary through ritual, belief, and observation. It bridged the gap between necessity and hope, discipline and magic, food and fortune. In the confined, unpredictable world of a 19th century vessel, every loaf carried meaning beyond calories. It was a symbol of safety, respect, and survival. Life aboard a 19th century ship was relentless, filled with long hours of labor, exposure to harsh weather, and the ever-present threat of illness or accident. In this environment, moments of celebration, comfort, and routine were treasured, and bread often played a central role. It was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of home, community, and small pleasures that brightened the long days at sea. One of the most common forms of celebration involved festive meals. When the captain or officers marked a holiday, a successful voyage milestone, or even a crew member's birthday, bread was often elevated beyond its daily role. Freshly baked loaves, soft if supplies allowed, or carefully toasted hardtack, were shared among sailors. In some cases, special shapes or decorations were added. Simple yet meaningful gestures that transformed an ordinary staple into a centerpiece of cheer. Bread also served as comfort food. After a grueling day of hoisting sails, scrubbing decks, or navigating storms, sailors would gather to break bread together. Even a small slice of fresh loaf could lift spirits, reminding men of home and hearth. In ports where ingredients were available, bread might be paired with cheese, salted meats, or preserved fruits, creating rare moments of indulgence. For many, these meals reinforced camaraderie and offered psychological relief from the monotony and danger of life at sea. Special breads were sometimes baked for Sundays or religious observances. Sailors, like their families ashore, observed rituals tied to faith, and bread played a role in marking these moments. A loaf might be blessed or held aside as part of communal prayers or small onboard ceremonies. Even in the absence of clergy, the act of setting aside something wholesome and nourishing reflected a shared culture of respect, mindfulness, and continuity with life on land. Port visits brought additional opportunities for culinary creativity. Bakers in harbor towns sold loaves with varying degrees of freshness, shapes, and ingredients. Sailors would sometimes purchase these to supplement their ship's provisions, introducing new flavors and textures to their otherwise monotonous diet. Bread became a bridge between the shipboard routine and the wider world, a tangible connection to places, people, and cultures beyond the vessel's wooden hull. The social dimension of bread extended to cooperation and hierarchy aboard the ship. Officers and more experienced sailors often distributed rations, teaching younger or less skilled crew members how to handle bread properly, break portions fairly, and avoid waste. Sharing bread fostered trust and reinforced the unwritten rules of conduct among men confined together for long stretches. Even in scarcity, these practices maintained morale, order, and a sense of fairness critical to survival. Bread also shaped leisure and downtime. Sailors would sometimes play simple games, using small rolls or slices as tokens, or experiment with recipes using limited ingredients. Though crude, these acts of creativity offered amusement and mental stimulation. In stormy weather when work was impossible, breaking bread together could fill hours, providing both sustenance and a temporary escape from anxiety and fatigue. On long voyages, stale bread was often repurposed creatively. Hardtack could be softened in water, tea, or coffee, transforming it into porridge or makeshift cake. Crumbs were incorporated into soups or thickened stews, while trimmings were saved for future meals. These practices demonstrate not only ingenuity, but also a collective understanding of thrift, necessity, and the value of every calorie in a setting where supply was limited and resupply uncertain. Even the smallest rituals surrounding bread carried emotional weight. Passing a loaf with care, slicing it evenly among men, or saving the freshest portion for someone ill or fatigued reflected compassion and attention to community. Bread became a medium for expressing respect, empathy, and solidarity, reinforcing social bonds crucial for life aboard. The psychological role of bread should not be underestimated. In an environment dominated by wind, waves, and uncertainty, the simple act of breaking, sharing, or savoring a loaf grounded sailors in familiarity and routine. Its presence offered reassurance, continuity, and comfort, reminders that despite danger and isolation, the basic necessities of life could still be maintained. Ultimately, bread at sea was a symbol of endurance, adaptability, and human connection. Its role went far beyond nutrition. It structured daily life, marked celebrations, mediated social interactions, and offered solace in times of stress. Through careful management, creative preparation, and shared enjoyment, sailors imbued an ordinary staple with extraordinary significance. Keeping bread edible on a 19th century ship was no simple task. The ocean was unforgiving, the weather unpredictable, and supplies limited. Sailors and ship cooks faced a constant battle against spoilage, mold, and the creeping effects of salt, humidity, and heat. Yet necessity is a powerful teacher, and over time, ingenious methods emerged that balance practicality, survival, and taste. The first challenge was moisture. Ships were damp by nature. Rain, sea spray, and condensation made the wooden decks, storage areas, and even the galley itself susceptible to humidity. Bread, being highly perishable, was particularly vulnerable. Soft loaves could mold within days, and even hardened bread could become soggy if improperly stored. Ship cooks developed a keen understanding of airflow, ventilation, and storage placement to protect their rations. Loaves were stacked in racks with space between each, often elevated above the deck, or placed in areas shielded from direct moisture. Every crevice mattered, as the slightest damp patch could doom an entire batch. Hardtack, the ship's stalwart bread, was baked specifically for longevity. Twice baked and exceedingly dry, it was nearly impervious to mold, though its taste and texture left much to be desired. Sailors quickly learned that hardtack required preparation before consumption. Soaking in water, tea, coffee, or soup softened enough to be edible. Some became adept at flavoring it with molasses, sugar, or fat, transforming a bland, rock-hard ration into a tolerable, if still functional, meal. These innovations highlight the creativity spurred by necessity. A mundane staple became a canvas for culinary ingenuity under extreme conditions. Salt also played a role beyond flavor. Coarse salt sprinkled among stored loaves absorbed residual moisture, slowing spoilage. In combination with tightly sealed wooden containers or cloth wrappings, this simple technique could keep bread edible for weeks. Sailors relied on these methods not only to avoid hunger, but to prevent disease. Spoiled bread was more than unpleasant. It could cause sickness in men already weakened by long voyages. Shipboard baking demanded strict discipline. Galley schedules were carefully planned around wind, tide, and crew routines. Baking too early risked spoilage before the bread could be eaten. Baking too late disrupted meal times and labor schedules. Cooks developed a rhythm, balancing temperature, timing, and quantity. Smaller batches were baked more frequently when possible, while larger loaves were reserved for emergencies or longer trips between ports. Observant crews quickly learned the signs of underbaked, overbaked, or poorly stored bread, and everyone had a role in protecting the precious supply. Innovations extended beyond simple techniques. Some vessels experimented with containers lined with paper or cloth to absorb moisture. Others used herbs or spices thought to repel spoilage, echoing the folk remedies familiar from land-based kitchens. Ship diaries occasionally mention attempts to keep loaves near warm areas of the galley to prevent dampness, while avoiding direct heat that would dry or crack the crust. These adaptations reflect a blend of trial and error science and practical wisdom, passed down from one voyage to the next. Resourcefulness also included repurposing. Any bread that had begun to harden or show minor spoilage was transformed into puddings, stews, or soups, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Crew members became adept at improvising meals from limited ingredients, often using stale bread as a filler to supplement small portions of meat, fish, or vegetables. Even the unpleasant taste of old hardtack could be improved with soaking, sweeteners, or fat, a small victory in the ongoing struggle against monotony and hunger. The human element was equally important. Maintaining bread required teamwork, communication, and trust. Officers and cooks coordinated storage, rationing, and preparation, while sailors were taught proper handling techniques to avoid contamination or unnecessary loss. Bread became a test of discipline as much as a source of calories. A careless crew member could ruin an entire batch, creating tension and underscoring the collective responsibility required for survival. Finally, shipboard bread reflects the broader theme of adaptation. Sailors were at the mercy of natural forces, yet through observation, experimentation, and shared knowledge, they developed a system that balanced practicality and endurance. Bread was both sustenance and a tool for social cohesion, morale, and survival. Its preservation demanded skill, patience, and ingenuity, qualities that defined life at sea. Life at sea was harsh, monotonous, and often monotonously harsh. Sailors spent long days in cramped quarters, exposed to wind, salt, and relentless labor. Food, particularly bread, became both a source of sustenance and a stage for unusual habits. Quirks born from necessity, boredom, or the desire to make the daily ration more bearable. The bread itself, whether soft loaves or hardtack, was rarely consumed plain. Over time, sailors developed peculiar routines, creative flavorings, and even superstitions around it. Hardtack, the infamous ship's biscuit, was notoriously tough. To soften it, sailors would soak it in liquids, water, coffee, tea, or even beer or rum. Some went further, placing the hardtack between cloths and pressing it with mallets or rolling pins, hoping to break the rock-hard texture into manageable fragments. On long voyages, it became a kind of ritual. Each sailor developed his preferred method of preparation, sharing tips in hushed conversation over the galley fire. The repetitive pounding and soaking was oddly satisfying, a small act of control in an unpredictable environment. Flavoring bread was another creative outlet. Molasses, sugar, lard, and butter were often used to improve taste. Sailors would mix crumbs of hardtack into porridge, soups, or stews, transforming the bland biscuit into a hearty, more palatable meal. Occasionally, they combined it with whatever protein was on hand, salted beef, dried fish, or pickled vegetables. Some even experimented with herbs or leaves found on shore stops, attempting to add variety to otherwise monotonous rations. These small touches revealed both resourcefulness and a desire for comfort amidst a stark routine. Sailors also developed peculiar rituals around bread consumption. For instance, some would always eat the same piece of hardtack first, believing it brought luck or warded off seasickness. Others believed that a certain soaking liquid, coffee, tea, or diluted rum, made the bread last longer or taste better, even if the effect was mostly psychological. Superstitions and habit intertwined, turning a simple act of eating into a performance of tradition, reassurance, and camaraderie. Improvisation extended to preserving bread for social or morale purposes. Officers often had slightly better rations, and sharing a piece of fresh loaf or properly soaked hardtack could boost morale among the crew. Sailors learned to hide small portions of particularly tasty bread, hoarding them for moments of indulgence or sharing secretly with friends. Bread, in this sense, was currency, a means of negotiation, gift-giving, or playful rivalry, infusing social dynamics with layers beyond mere nutrition. Even the shaping of bread inspired quirky practices. Hardtack could be broken into unusual shapes to fit into storage containers or to make it easier to eat quickly during the workday. Sailors sometimes carved initials or symbols into the surface before baking, personalizing what otherwise looked like uniform and personal rations. These small acts of creativity allowed individuals to leave their mark on the unyielding, monotonous shipboard life. Texture and sound were also part of the experience. The crunch of hardtack, the chewiness of softened edges, the aroma of coffee-soaked biscuits, all became sensory rituals. Some sailors found amusement in smashing the biscuits deliberately, producing clouds of crumbs or dramatic snaps. It was a form of entertainment, a minor diversion in an otherwise demanding and repetitive existence. These habits reflect a broader truth. Even in extreme conditions, humans adapt, personalize, and find pleasure in routine. Bread, simple though it was, became a canvas for ingenuity, an emotional anchor, and a small source of joy. The peculiar methods of preparation, consumption, and sharing tell us as much about life aboard 19th century ships as do logbooks, captain's orders, or navigational charts. Finally, these habits underscore the social dimension of bread at sea. Mealtime was a shared experience, often bringing the crew together in brief moments of reprieve. Even a dull, dry biscuit could become a vessel for connection, humor, and survival. The interplay of necessity, creativity, and camaraderie gave the daily ration a significance far beyond its nutritional value. Life aboard a 19th century ship was governed by strict routines, hierarchies, and rules, bread included. Officers carefully rationed provisions, particularly the precious soft loaves and hardtack, to ensure the crew survived long voyages. Every sailor understood that one misstep could mean running out of food, and yet, even in the face of deprivation, human ingenuity and sly mischief found ways to bend the rules. Rations were meticulously calculated. Soft bread, when available, was often reserved for officers or special occasions, while hardtack served as the primary sustenance for the common sailor. Quantities were measured daily, sometimes down to ounces, and any attempt to hoard or exceed one's share was harshly punished. Officers maintained a vigilant eye. Every crumb counted, and waste was a serious offense. Sailors learned quickly that discretion and cleverness were just as important as strength and skill in surviving shipboard life. Despite the strict control, sailors developed methods to stretch rations and supplement their diet. Hardtack could be soaked in water, coffee, or soup to make it more filling. Crumbs might be gathered from corners or the galley floor, and small barter systems emerged, where sailors exchanged pieces of bread, salted meat, or dried fish to balance their meals. These informal networks were often kept secret from the officers, forming a shadow economy driven by necessity and cunning. Hunger bred creativity. Some sailors became adept at softening rock-hard biscuits by pressing them under barrels or heating them lightly near the stove. Others would secretly flavor bread with whatever was at hand: salted fat, syrup from barrels, or even scavenged vegetables. In extreme cases, rations were stretched by grinding hardtack into powder and mixing it with water or coffee to make a thick porridge. These adaptations were essential for surviving long stretches at sea, particularly in winter storms or during unexpected delays. Discipline around bread also reinforced social hierarchies. Officers ate first, often enjoying small comforts like freshly baked loaves or lightly sweetened bread, while common sailors made do with the plainest, hardest biscuits. Senior crew members might control distribution within their own ranks, rewarding diligence or punishing minor infractions by withholding portions. The management of bread became a subtle but constant reminder of rank, obedience, and survival. Yet, deprivation also inspired playful rebellion. Sailors hid small portions of soft bread to savor later, shared morsels in secret, or engaged in competitive raids, to claim extra portions. These minor acts of defiance were rarely dangerous, but they kept morale alive and reinforced bonds among the crew. Bread, though tightly rationed, became a symbol of cleverness, resilience, and camaraderie. Each stolen slice or secretly softened biscuit carried pride, humor, and a touch of defiance against authority. The extreme scarcity on long voyages also fostered ritualistic behaviors. Sailors often treated bread with respect, never wasting a crumb, breaking it carefully, and sometimes sharing the first piece with a companion before eating their own. There were even superstitions. A loaf placed in a certain position might ward off bad luck or ensure that rations lasted until the next supply stopped. These small rituals offered a sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable environment. The discipline surrounding bread also reflected the broader hardships of maritime life. Delays, storms, or spoilage could leave the crew hungry, tired, and anxious. Officers had to maintain order while ensuring that the limited provisions lasted the journey. Sailors, in turn, learned to navigate scarcity with patience, creativity, and cunning. Bread, in this context, was far more than food. It was a tool of management, a test of resourcefulness, and a measure of endurance. Through these strictures, we see how deprivation shaped behavior, culture, and ingenuity at sea. Bread rationing demanded observation, planning, and teamwork. Sailors learned to anticipate shortages, improvise solutions, and cooperate in the shadow of authority. Hunger, far from merely a physical condition, became a teacher, disciplining both mind and body in the harsh lessons of maritime life. Life at sea in the 19th century was as much a struggle against fear as it was against the elements. For sailors, superstition was not just a quirk. It was a guide, a compass for navigating the unpredictable moods of wind, water, and weather. While modern minds might scoff at these beliefs, to a sailor in 1850, rituals and omens carried weight as real as the ship's timbers or the strength of storm. Every action, every habit could be read as either a ward against misfortune or a magnet for disaster. One of the most common superstitions involved luck charms. Sailors often carried small tokens with them at all times: coins, pieces of wood, or tiny carvings of saints or animals. Some believed that a particular coin, kept in the pocket, could ensure a safe journey, while others trusted in a piece of rope blessed by the ship's chaplain. These charms were more than sentimental objects. They were tools for psychological survival. A sailor grasping his lucky coin during a storm might feel steadier, calmer, and more capable of performing the vital tasks that kept him and his ship alive. Colors and clothing were another source of superstition. Some ships forbade certain colors entirely, fearing that they might provoke storms or anger the sea gods. Red was often considered unlucky, while green might be avoided by superstitious crews for fear of unseen spirits. On occasion, sailors would wear clothing inside out or tie knots in their belts before leaving port, rituals meant to confuse bad luck or attract favorable winds. Even the way a sailor braided his hair, rolled his sleeves, or tied his scarf could carry meaning. Each small gesture was steeped in a belief system that linked the visible to the invisible, the mundane to the mystical. Weather, of course, inspired countless customs. Sailors watched clouds, wind shifts, and the behavior of birds and fish with intense scrutiny. A sudden drop in temperature might be seen as a warning. A pod of whales close to the ship could be interpreted as an omen. Many sailors held the idea that certain days were luckier than others, often tied to the lunar calendar or to saints' feast days. It was common practice to avoid starting a voyage on a bad day, even if that meant waiting for weeks before departure. Superstitions were woven into the rhythm of daily life, shaping schedules, duties, and even leisure time. Taboos also dominated the shipboard culture. A classic example: no woman was allowed on deck while the ship was at sea, believed to anger the spirits of the ocean. Whistling was often forbidden, lest it whistle up a storm, and whistling inside the cabin could bring misfortune to the crew. Stepping onto the deck with your left foot first, knocking on wood before casting off, or even avoiding certain words could become ritualized habits that structured every movement aboard a vessel. These customs, odd as they might seem, created a shared language of caution, community, and trust among sailors who relied on each other for survival. Beyond luck and taboos, rituals serve social purposes. Superstitions reinforce hierarchy, discipline, and teamwork. Senior sailors or captains were expected to enforce proper observances, while novices learned quickly that flouting ritual could invite ridicule, or worse, real consequences. Sharing charms, teaching the correct way to perform a ritual, or recounting stories of luck and disaster passed down from seasoned sailors created a culture of mentorship, oral history, and community knowledge. In many ways, the strange habits of superstition strengthened cohesion on board, ensuring that even the most frightened sailor knew his role in the grand choreography of ship life. Food and drink, too, intersected with superstition. Certain meals were avoided on unlucky days, and salt or bread might be sprinkled in special ways to ward off bad luck. Drinking routines often included toasts to favorable winds or safe passage, repeated with careful phrasing so as not to tempt the sea's ire. Every habit, no matter how trivial, was a small ritual meant to impose order on the chaos of waves and weather. Even the arrangement of hammocks, barrels, and ropes could carry significance, a subtle acknowledgement that careful attention might invite fortune and avert disaster. Ultimately, superstition on 19th century ships was a practical psychology disguised as odd habit. It gave sailors a sense of control in a world governed by unpredictable forces. By observing rituals, carrying charms, avoiding taboos, and interpreting signs, sailors transformed uncertainty into a structured, navigable routine. Life at sea remained dangerous, the storms relentless, the seas indifferent. But superstition provided a framework to endure, survive, and even thrive. It was a blend of fear, creativity, and communal understanding that allowed sailors to face each day with a measure of courage, even when surrounded by the vast and unknowable ocean. As we leave superstition behind, we'll next explore how sailors managed health, hygiene, and peculiar remedies at sea, a world where necessity often led to the strangest habits, and where survival sometimes meant bending logic in the name of practicality. Life at sea in the 19th century was rough, not just because of storms or long hours, but because maintaining health and hygiene was a daily battle. Ships were cramped, crowded, and rarely clean by modern standards. Water was limited, bathing opportunities scarce, and disease could spread with terrifying speed. Sailors developed peculiar habits and inventive remedies, some practical, some bizarre, all aimed at surviving long voyages while coping with the relentless challenges of life on the ocean. Bathing, for example, was infrequent. Fresh water was a precious commodity, often rationed for drinking and cooking, so washing was usually done in small basins or not at all. Sailors relied on rubbing themselves with salt water, sand, or vinegar to reduce odor and remove grime. Some even applied mixtures of vinegar and alcohol to their skin to repel lice or prevent infections. While modern eyes might see these practices as harsh, they were often the most effective tools available to maintain basic hygiene in conditions where traditional bathing was nearly impossible. Hair and beards were treated with similar ingenuity. Long hair could be braided or tied to keep it clean, and pomades or oils, sometimes scented with herbs, were used to mask odor or soften coarse strands. Beards, if allowed by ship rules, were trimmed carefully, as lice and scabies thrived in unkempt hair. In some cases, sailors would shave completely to avoid infestations, while others relied on combs made of bone or wood to remove pests. These routines, however odd, were a constant part of life at sea, blending personal grooming with practical health measures. Diet and food preparation intersected with hygiene in fascinating ways. Fresh food was rare. Salted meat, hardtack, and dried legumes formed the staples. Spoiled food could be deadly, so sailors developed keen senses for detecting off flavors or mold. Vinegar, alcohol, and strong spices were often used to preserve food or disguise decay. Hardtack, while tough and unappetizing, was valued not just for its longevity, but also because it was less likely to harbor bacteria. The constant vigilance over provisions was a form of hygiene in itself, ensuring that nutrition was not sabotaged by invisible threats. Illness and injury were ever-present concerns, and remedies often mixed observation with superstition. Seasickness, common on long voyages, was treated with a range of strategies. Some sailors chewed ginger, others tied charms around their wrists, and a few even believed that sleeping in a particular position could keep nausea at bay. Cuts, bruises, and infections were treated with salves made from herbs, alcohol, or animal fat. In extreme cases, sailors resorted to more alarming measures, such as cauterizing wounds or using mercury compounds to fight disease, a dangerous but historically documented practice. The management of waste and sanitation was another challenge. Ships had limited facilities, and close quarters meant that smells, germs, and lice spread quickly. Sailors developed routines to clean decks, sweep living quarters, and maintain ventilation as best they could. While primitive, these measures reflected a keen understanding of cause and effect. Filth invited illness, so cleanliness, even if partial, was essential for survival. Salt water, vinegar, and sand were tools in this constant effort to stave off disease. Personal superstition often merged with hygiene practices. Certain herbs were believed to purify the air or ward off sickness. Rosemary, thyme, and bay leaves might be hung in cabins, sprinkled in sleeping areas, or mixed into simple remedies. Vinegar was used both for cleaning and as a protective agent against invisible bad airs that sailors associated with disease. These overlapping approaches, practical and mystical, demonstrate how sailors combined observation, experience, and tradition in daily life at sea. Even small routines became rituals. Washing hands before meals, brushing teeth with cloths or herbs, and airing out bedding were not only hygiene measures, but also ways to impose order and maintain morale. In cramped, noisy, and uncertain conditions, such rituals offered predictability, a sense of control, and a psychological buffer against the relentless hardships of life aboard a 19th century ship. Ultimately, the strange habits and remedies of sailors reveal a mix of necessity, observation, and creativity. Cleanliness, diet, and personal care were far from simple tasks. They were strategies for survival. Every layer of soap, vinegar, herb, or salt was a response to the ever-present threats of disease, decay, and discomfort. These practices might seem peculiar today, but they were the product of hard-earned wisdom, trial, and the sheer will to endure. Life aboard a 19th century ship was grueling, with long hours of labor, harsh weather, and constant vigilance against storms and illness. Yet even amid this demanding routine, sailors found ways to entertain themselves, maintain morale, and build camaraderie. Leisure was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a way to preserve mental health and reinforce bonds between men who relied on each other for survival. Games were a central part of shipboard life. Simple card games, dice, and board games passed the time during long watches or stormy days when working on deck was impossible. These games were often makeshift, with sailors crafting boards, pieces, or tokens from scraps of wood, bone, or cloth. Gambling was common, though usually modest. A coin, a bit of tobacco, or a small snack might serve as stakes. Winning or losing carried social weight, offering bragging rights, temporary status, and friendly rivalry. Small moments of excitement in an otherwise monotonous routine. Storytelling was another cornerstone of morale. Sailors shared tall tales, ghost stories, and accounts of past voyages, sometimes embellishing them for dramatic effect. These stories were a form of entertainment, but also a way to teach lessons, pass on knowledge of navigation, storms, or distant ports, and keep the crew mentally engaged. Humor, in particular, was vital. A well-timed joke or an exaggerated tale could lift spirits, diffuse tension, and strengthen the sense of shared experience necessary for for a cohesive crew. Music played a surprisingly important role, too. Instruments were scarce, but those who could play a fiddle, concertina, or flute often became the unofficial entertainers of the ship. Singing together, sea shanties, ballads, or improvised tunes, helped synchronize work, keep energy up during laborious tasks like hoisting sails, and offered emotional release. Even simple percussion, tapping on barrels or boxes, created rhythm and community. Music was both functional and recreational, merging the practical with the pleasurable in the life of a sailor. Physical games also found a place, especially on calm decks or during periods of low activity. Tug-of-war contests, climbing competitions, or races around the rigging tested strength, agility, and courage. Such activities reinforced teamwork and stamina, as well as providing harmless outlets for energy and frustration. They allowed sailors to compete in a controlled way, turning boredom into physical challenge and camaraderie into entertainment. Creativity and craft occupied long hours at sea, too. Sailors carved whittlings from scraps of wood, made model ships, or repaired personal gear. These small projects required patience and skill, offering a mental diversion while also producing tangible rewards. A carved figure, a carefully stitched pouch, or a decorated box might become a keepsake or a gift, preserving memory and pride amid monotonous routines. Crafting allowed sailors to exercise ingenuity, connect with their cultural traditions, and leave a mark on an otherwise transient environment. Reading, when possible, was another cherished pastime. Books, newspapers, or handwritten letters provided news, diversion, and intellectual stimulation. Literacy varied among crews, but even sailors with limited skills engaged with texts, reciting aloud, copying passages, or listening attentively. Education, entertainment, and social bonding overlapped in these moments, proving that mental stimulation was as crucial as physical activity for life at sea. Drinking, though often criticized, was also part of leisure. Rum, beer, or other spirits were rationed and consumed in moderation or during special occasions. Beyond intoxication, shared drinks created ritual, camaraderie, and temporary relief from stress. Toasts, songs, and storytelling accompanied alcohol, reinforcing group cohesion. Mismanaged, drinking could become a source of conflict, but when balanced with work and other activities, it strengthened morale. The social fabric of shipboard life relied on these diversions. Fun, games, music, and creativity were not trivial. They were survival tools for mental health, social cohesion, and resilience. Sailors endured physical hardship far better when their minds had outlets for stress, boredom, and fear. The rituals and habits of leisure reflected both ingenuity and human adaptability, proving that even in extreme conditions, people seek connection, joy, and meaning. Life at sea in the 19th century was filled with uncertainty, danger, and moments that tested both skill and courage. Sailors faced storms, hidden shoals, disease, and long stretches of monotony. And in such an environment, superstition became both a comfort and a guide. Folklore, port customs, and rituals shaped everyday life on ships, providing a framework for understanding the unknown and maintaining psychological balance. One of the most pervasive beliefs involved omens. Sailors read signs in the weather, the behavior of birds, or the appearance of the moon and stars. A sudden change in wind or an unexpected fog could be interpreted as a warning of misfortune, while favorable signs were celebrated. These interpretations were not merely idle fantasy. They influenced decision-making. A captain might delay sailing, or a crew might adjust watch routines based on patterns observed over years of experience. Superstition, in this sense, was intertwined with practical knowledge, a blend of caution, tradition, and intuition. Animals on board carried their own symbolism. Cats, for instance, were widely regarded as good luck. They controlled vermin populations, but beyond their practical use, a ship's cat was believed to ward off storms and protect sailors from misfortune. Conversely, The presence of rats or the untimely death of a ship's pet could inspire anxiety and elaborate explanations for impending trouble. Even birds that followed ships were interpreted as messengers or omens, their behavior scrutinized closely by seasoned crews. Certain objects and rituals were considered essential for good fortune. A sailor might carry a lucky coin, a charm, or a piece of fabric given by a loved one. Tattoos, often of anchors, swallows, or nautical stars, were not only decorative but symbolic, offering protection and a sense of identity among the crew. Breaking a mirror, whistling below decks, or painting a ship in certain ways could be viewed as courting disaster, while following established customs brought reassurance. These practices were as much about mental stability as they were about actual luck. Names and words mattered too. Sailors avoided mentioning certain things, such as whales or storms, directly, fearing that speaking them aloud might summon misfortune. Some ships followed strict protocols for entering new ports, raising flags in precise sequences, or observing silent moments for departed sailors. Language became a ritualized tool for controlling the unpredictable, a way of making the unknowable feel slightly more manageable. Superstitions often intersected with hierarchy and discipline. Senior officers sometimes enforced certain rituals or forbade specific actions, not solely out of fear of bad luck, but to maintain order and cohesion. Observing these beliefs created shared norms, reinforced authority, and gave everyone a sense of security. Even skeptical sailors often followed practices outwardly, respecting tradition and avoiding conflict with peers or superiors. Sailors also created their own narratives to explain tragic events. Shipwrecks, illness, and accidents were rarely attributed purely to chance. They were framed as consequences of ignoring warnings, breaking taboos, or upsetting the natural balance. These stories circulated in taverns, ports, and on board, shaping collective wisdom and perpetuating cautionary tales. In this way, superstition functioned as an informal system of risk management. The impact of superstition extended beyond psychological comfort. Beliefs influenced scheduling, navigation, and even maintenance routines. A crew wary of cursed days might postpone tasks, while fear of omens encouraged vigilance, careful observation, and redundancy in preparations. In a perilous environment where human error could be fatal, these practices often had unintended practical benefits. Children and apprentices, observing the rituals and tales of older sailors, absorbed these customs as part of their education. Superstitions provided lessons in caution, respect for the sea, and the consequences of carelessness. At the same time, they instilled a sense of identity and belonging within the crew, creating shared knowledge and culture that transcended individual experience. Ultimately, superstition was not mere fantasy. It was a survival strategy, a psychological buffer, and a social glue. In a world where storms, disease, and accidents were ever present, rituals, charms, and omens gave sailors a sense of control, continuity, and purpose. The unseen forces of the ocean could not be defeated, but they could be acknowledged, respected, and ritualized. Life aboard a 19th century ship was physically demanding, mentally taxing, and often downright unsanitary. Sailors faced long voyages, cramped quarters, poor nutrition, and the constant threat of injury or illness. To survive, they developed strange, resourceful, and sometimes bizarre habits centered on the human body and its care. Cleanliness was a perpetual challenge. Fresh water was limited, and daily baths were a luxury almost never afforded. Sailors resorted to sponge baths, saltwater rinses, or rubbing themselves down with brine or vinegar to reduce the smell of sweat and prevent skin infections. Clothes were rarely washed. Instead, they were aired out, scrubbed only when absolutely necessary, or treated with smoke or salt to ward off pests and odors. This improvisation extended to hair, which could go weeks without a proper wash, leaving sailors with wild, tangled manes, sometimes braided or tied up to maintain some semblance of order. The diet at sea directly influenced health, and it was often grim. Hardtack, salted meat, dried legumes, and occasional shipboard fish formed the staples. Fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce, leading to vitamin deficiencies like scurvy. To counter this, some ships stocked citrus or sauerkraut, and inventive sailors learned to make teas and decoctions from seaweed or shipboard herbs. Meals were designed for survival, not pleasure, and improvisation was key. Every edible plant or animal product could become part of the ration. Sleep and physical routines were also unconventional. Sailors worked in shifts, meaning rest was fragmented and irregular. Hatches, masts, and deck spaces became makeshift beds, with hammocks strung wherever possible. Physical labor, hoisting sails, pumping water, scrubbing decks, kept the body active, but also caused injuries, blisters, and exhaustion. Sailors developed calluses, lean muscles, and a tolerance for discomfort, adapting to the demands of constant movement and hard work. Injury care on ships was both practical and bizarre. Sailors treated cuts, burns, and sprains with whatever materials were available. Alcohol, vinegar, honey, or poultices made from seaweed and herbs. Broken bones were splinted crudely, sometimes with rope and wooden boards. Infection was a constant threat, and amputation was a grim reality for severe cases. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, was a blend of medic, pharmacist, and folk healer, using both formal knowledge and trial-and-error remedies. Hygiene extended to the teeth, an area of particular creativity. Toothbrushes were rare. Sailors improvised with rags, twigs, or frayed ropes soaked in salt water or soot. Some rubbed their teeth with charcoal, while others used vinegar solutions to whiten or clean their mouths. Bad breath, decay, and gum disease were common, but any small improvement was valued as both a practical and social necessity. The human body also became a canvas for ritual and habit. Superstitions guided some health practices. Certain foods were avoided on unlucky days, wounds were treated with ceremonial attention, and charms were sometimes applied to protect from sickness. Sailors' rituals, while sometimes rooted in folklore, often complemented their practical care, reinforcing hygiene, diet, and rest as part of survival. Mental health was equally critical, though less discussed. Isolation, monotony, and fear of the sea could drive men to extremes. Some coped with storytelling, music, card games, or alcohol. Others developed odd habits, talking to objects, performing repetitive tasks, or practicing strange sea exercises to maintain alertness. These behaviors were adaptive, keeping the mind engaged in an environment with few outlets for leisure. Perhaps the strangest practices emerged when food, water, and medicine were scarce. Sailors sometimes resorted to eating unconventional items: rats, shipboard vermin, or preserved insects. Urine and seawater were occasionally used in rudimentary treatments for burns, sores, or infections. While shocking to modern sensibilities, these measures reflect ingenuity under extreme pressure, a combination of necessity, tradition, and observation. By examining hygiene, diet, and health on 19th century ships, we see how sailors adapted to their environment with resourcefulness, pragmatism, and sometimes downright eccentricity. The human body was both a tool and a liability. Survival required creativity, constant vigilance, and an acceptance of discomfort. Daily routines, rituals, and odd habits were as essential to life as sails, ropes, and navigation. Life at sea in the 19th century was a harsh blend of work, danger, and monotony. Sailors spent long days hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, and navigating unforgiving waters. But when the work was done, a curious world of leisure and ritual unfolded. One that combined play, superstition, and creativity in ways outsiders might find bizarre. Games were common, and they were rarely gentle. Sailors passed time with dice, cards, or improvised board games drawn in chalk on the deck. Gambling was frequent, sometimes for coins, other times for personal items, or even food rations. Luck mattered at sea, and games offered both entertainment and a way to measure skill. or misfortune. A single roll of the dice could bring joy or a heated quarrel. Yet beyond the competition, games created camaraderie, reinforcing social bonds in the confined, tense environment of a ship. Music was another crucial outlet. Sailors sang work songs while hoisting sails or hauling lines, using rhythm to coordinate effort and lift spirits. When labor paused, instruments appeared. Fiddles, flutes, or even makeshift drums fashioned from barrels or boxes. Singing and dancing broke the monotony of long voyages, and songs often carried stories, warnings, or humor about life at sea. Some melodies were bawdy, some sentimental, but all reinforced identity and community among the crew. Storytelling thrived in the evenings. Sailors told tales of sea monsters, shipwrecks, and ghostly apparitions, each story embroidered with exaggeration and suspense. Superstitions and folklore were deeply intertwined with leisure. Certain birds, weather patterns, or odd phenomena became signs of luck or doom, and these beliefs shaped games, dares, and even jokes. A sailor might spend hours recounting the misadventures of a green hand who ignored a lucky ritual, drawing both laughter and cautionary lessons. Rituals and quirky traditions also structure downtime. Shaving contests, rope tying competitions, and even mock ceremonies celebrated birthdays or successful voyages. Hazing of new crew members, known as pollywogs or green hands, was common, ranging from harmless pranks to elaborate theatrical rituals. While harsh by modern standards, these traditions helped integrate newcomers into the social fabric of the ship, teaching lessons in endurance, cooperation, and respect for hierarchy. Food and drink became part of leisure culture. Sailors developed curious tastes for preserved items, sometimes experimenting with condiments or mixing rations in unusual ways. Celebrations included improvised desserts, rum-based concoctions, or playful competitions over who could eat the oddest combination. Meals were both nourishment and entertainment, a way to turn scarcity into creativity and fun. Physical challenges were also entertainment. Climbing masts, running along rigging, or balancing on wet decks served dual purposes: practical training and amusement. Speed, skill, and daring were celebrated, and competitions became social events. Sailors learned not only the ship's ropes, but also their own limits, turning dangerous tasks into moments of sport. Superstitions permeated leisure. Many sailors believed in charms, rituals, or lucky objects that could influence games or daily fortune. Some refused to whistle aboard ship for fear of storms. Others carried small tokens for protection. These beliefs shaped behaviors, dictated traditions, and gave shape to the otherwise chaotic rhythms of life at sea. Even playful acts carried an undercurrent of caution, blending amusement with survival instincts. Humor was a vital tool. Jokes, songs, and pranks kept morale high. Sailors' laughter often hid frustration, fear, or homesickness. Exaggeration, mimicry, and theatrical storytelling were common, allowing men to bond through shared amusement while deflecting tension. Humor became a social glue, essential for life aboard a vessel where isolation and danger were ever present. In sum, entertainment at sea was inventive, communal, and often strange. Sailors turned scarcity into opportunity, blending competition, music, storytelling, superstition, and physical skill into a culture uniquely adapted to life on the water. These practices reveal how humans seek joy, camaraderie, and identity even in the harshest conditions. Downtime was never wasted. It was a laboratory of tradition, innovation, and survival. By the time we reached the end of our voyage through the world of 19th century sailors, a vivid picture emerges, not just of life at sea, but of human ingenuity, resilience, and the peculiar ways people adapted to extreme circumstances. From daily routines to unusual habits, from food preservation to games and rituals, sailors created a microcosm of culture that was both practical and fascinatingly strange. Much of what we've explored, odd meals, hardtack ingenuity, elaborate leisure rituals, and elaborate superstitions, reflects the tension between survival and humanity. Life at sea demanded vigilance. Every task, from maintaining the rigging to monitoring provisions, carried consequences. Moldy bread, spoiled rations, or careless navigation could mean sickness, wasted resources, or even disaster. Yet within these constraints, sailors discovered creativity and joy, fashioning systems, rituals, and stories that kept morale alive during months at sea. Their habits and rituals were as much about psychology as practicality. Games, music, storytelling, and competitions weren't mere distractions. They reinforced social hierarchies, provided mental relief, and nurtured bonds between crew members. Even the oddest traditions, like elaborate hazing ceremonies or strange superstitions, carried subtle lessons about cooperation, respect, and survival. These practices were never frivolous. They were survival strategies encoded in culture. Food habits stand out as particularly revealing. Sailors faced perishable provisions, long voyages, and the threat of scarcity. Hardtack, salted meats, preserved vegetables, and even the occasional folk remedy became daily necessities. Creativity turned necessity into ritual. Soaking hard biscuits in water or alcohol, combining rations in unusual ways, or devising strategies to stave off mold. Every action around food was both functional and symbolic, reflecting discipline, patience, and resourcefulness. The leisure and social life aboard ship reveal another layer of complexity. Music, humor, storytelling, and playful competitions were essential to mental health, camaraderie, and identity. Even superstition, seemingly irrational today, offered structure and comfort. Beliefs in omens, charms, or rituals weren't just quaint habits. They shaped decisions, eased anxiety, and fostered a shared sense of purpose. Sailors lived in a world where danger was constant, and such rituals became small shields against the unpredictable sea. Yet beyond survival, there was culture. Sailors carried knowledge across oceans, blending practices from different ports, sharing songs, stories, and superstitions, and creating traditions unique to their ships. These habits reveal how communities adapt to environment, scarcity, and social pressures. They illuminate a way of life where creativity and discipline coexisted, where routine met improvisation, and where every act, no matter how small or strange, had meaning. Ultimately, the weird habits of 19th century sailors offer timeless lessons. They show how humans respond to constraint with ingenuity, how community emerges even in isolated environments, and how ritual, habit, and belief shape daily life. Observing their food practices, work routines, leisure activities, and superstitions reminds us that resilience often involves balancing practicality with imagination, discipline with play, and caution with risk. Today, the world of modern shipping, instant communication, and abundant food may seem light years away from the wooden decks of a 19th century vessel. But the essence of what sailors taught us endures. Vigilance matters, creativity saves, culture binds, and even the smallest routines can carry profound significance. Moldy bread, midnight dice games, odd superstitions, and ritualistic music were not just eccentricities. They were lifelines, lessons, and bonds forged in the crucible of the sea. As we close this exploration, we recognize that the story of 19th century sailors is a story of human ingenuity in extreme conditions. It is a portrait of adaptability, creativity, and social cohesion, revealing a world simultaneously harsh, humorous, and deeply human. From the tiniest loaf of hardtack to the grandest superstition, every habit, every ritual, and every strange custom tells a story of survival, identity, and community. In the end, studying these habits reminds us to observe the ordinary carefully, embrace creativity in constraints, and respect the small rituals that sustain life. The weird habits of sailors may seem distant and odd, but they resonate as timeless examples of how humans navigate uncertainty, scarcity, and the relentless challenges of the world. Lessons as relevant today as they were on those creaking, rolling decks over a century ago.